Now, when it comes to Islamophobia, there is a definition that the Muslim community has come up with when it comes to Islamophobia. So when it comes to anti-Semitism, the Jewish community have a working definition, IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism. Inspired from that, the Muslim community has also got a definition for Islamophobia.
Today's podcast is sponsored by two companies.
This video is sponsored by Chai Pani Blackburn, the hottest place to get your Carrick chai in South Asian street foods. Open from early and closes late means you'll never miss out on all your favorite foods. With a great indoor seating area with friendly staff at your service to a large shared car park with a drive-through style attendant taking your order so you don't have to leave the comfort of your vehicle. It's a perfect spot to meet and catch up with friends, so make sure you head down to Chai Pani Blackburn in partnership with Brain Cells Squared.
The second sponsors is a company called Tiny Tastes, based in Blackburn, Lancashire. Are you guys ready for this one? Because Tiny Tastes have sent me a sample of their product. And what Tiny Taste is, you've heard of Dubai chocolate. Tiny Tastes have incorporated Dubai chocolate into small bite-sized chocolates with different toppings on top. So we have a pistachio one, we have a Biscoff one, and we have an almond one. I've tried these before and they're absolutely amazing. I think we'll give it a go.
Sure.
Which one?
Almond, please.
Almond.
Me wander off.
Which one?
Pistachio.
We've got our awesome manager.
The camera guy.
Camera manager, HR, everything.
Almond one's really good. Almond one is really good. Almond's awesome.
So this is what you're working with. Absolutely amazing. Check them out. They're on Instagram.
Nice, isn't it? Oh, that's nice.
It is, isn't it?
So the all-party parliamentary group for British Muslims have put together, after consultation, a working definition for Islamophobia. And that Islamophobia mentions that Islamophobia is a form of racism. That's the first thing it mentions. That is a form of racism. And that form of racism, what it does is that it targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. So these are the two aspects of that definition.
For those that don't quite understand, expression of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness.
Absolutely. So let's get into that. Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. So something may or may not be Islamic. Something may or may not be Islamic, but it's perceived to be Muslim. So it may not be Islamic, but it's perceived to be Muslim. And therefore to target that would be discriminatory according to its definition. So Palestine will apply to this case. So Palestine as a country, in Palestine, do we just have Muslims in Palestine?
No.
Or do we also have
other
Christians and other faiths in Palestine? We have other faiths in Palestine, including the Christian community. So Palestine, one could argue, is a nation state, is not necessarily associated with Islam. One could argue that. One could argue because there's Christians there and there's other communities there. So it's not necessarily associated with Islam. However, it's perceived to be Muslim, isn't it? So the Muslim community themselves and the wider community see it associated with Islam and Muslims.
Of course.
That's sufficient. So strictly speaking, it doesn't have to be Islamic. Something doesn't have to be Islamic. It just has to be perceived as Muslim
For it to be
to fall under the definition
of
Islamophobia.
So it's like, for example, beards.
Yes.
Beards. A Sikh man.
Absolutely.
When
The Jewish man has it as well.
And how many times have a Sikh man been on internet? And people giving Islamophobic comments to that man, thinking he's a Muslim.
Absolutely. So that brings me to another point, which is I'm glad you've mentioned that, because the nature of Islamophobia is such that the victim of Islamophobia doesn't have to be a Muslim, and the perpetrator of Islamophobia doesn't have to be a Muslim. Do you see? Do you see the point? So in that case, you mentioned a Sikh having a beard being targeted. So if a Sikh's being targeted, why is it being targeted? Because that Sikh person's beard and appearance, his turban, is perceived to be Islamic, even though it's not Islamic. But that perception is sufficient for it to fall under the definition of Islamophobia. And similarly, the perpetrator. So a Muslim can be a perpetrator of Islamophobia.
Definitely.
Do you see? So, for example, if a Muslim curtails the free speech of another Muslim on Palestine, then that would be an example of a Muslim perpetrating Islamophobia.
If a non-scarf hijab wearing woman was to discriminate a scarf hijab wearing woman, or the other way around, that would also be internal.
So if someone, if a person targeted a Muslim person targeted another niqab wearing Muslim woman for wearing the niqab, that would be an example of Islamophobia.
And did what Boris Johnson said and called her a letterbox. That would be
that's
internal Islamophobia.
So that's Islamophobia, but that's coming from a non-Muslim.
That's coming. No, but so if
he still falls under the definition. But even if it came from a Muslim, it wouldn't justify it.
It wouldn't justify it.
That's the point.
Exactly.
That's the point. Yes.
The same way that brings up the thinking. The same way. And I think that this is an issue within our communities, the same way, not just Islamophobia, but racism as well, where racism is, there's a lot of internal racism within
our own community.
Pakistanis, Indians, Bengalis. There's certain groups that don't like each other, and
that's different. So that requires probably another podcast in the future. To go into details of that.
So 4 types of racism that you can touch on. That's what it says.
Yes. One aspect was Islamophobia, which I think you'll have a better appreciation of if you already don't. But the second aspect is institutional. Now that again is a technical term. Now, how the best way to understand. Now, one of the things that's been mentioned in the definition of Islamophobia is a form of racism. That's what it's been mentioned. It's a form of racism. So it works similarly. The patterns are similar to racism. And that's why the all-party parliamentary group for British Muslims associated Islamophobia with racism, because it works in similar ways. And therefore, the body of work that has been dedicated to the study of racism can also be applied to Islamophobia. That's the whole idea behind it. So if you speak to people who've been working in the all-party parliamentary group, like myself, I've had discussions with people who've been working in the all-party parliamentary group of British Muslims, and when you discuss why they've associated Islamophobia with racism, what has been mentioned is that so that the body of work that has been done in relation to racism can also be applied to Islamophobia. So Islamophobia doesn't come in a vacuum. There's a history there that other forms of discrimination, such as racism and anti-Semitism, have been acknowledged as inspiring the definition of Islamophobia. That's important. So we have to. So we can't say we're just doing Islamophobia. We have to also appreciate that Islamophobia ties in the same framework, ties into racism. The same framework ties into anti-Semitism. And that's been acknowledged by the all-party parliamentary group for British Muslims. So it's important to keep in mind as a side note. So the term institutional, in order to understand that, we first need to take a step back and understand the 4 levels of racism. So one level of racism is personal racism. It's also been referred to as internalized racism. So what does that mean? So for a person of color, personal racism, what does that mean? So as a person of color, you've at times internalized the inferiority of people of color. Don't you see that?
No, of course you do.
So many a time, and one could argue we've all been conditioned in some way, shape or form to see ourselves as inferior to the white person.
And that's been through centuries. That's come through centuries.
Absolutely. Conditioning through centuries.
Through the British Empire and all that kind of stuff.
Absolutely. So that's internalized racism. So that's the first level of racism. Now that internalized racism or personal racism is also applicable to a white person. So the white person has internalized, to the contrary, their superiority. So that's the conditioning. That's not like, so some people argue that, or are you arguing that white people are born racist? No. You're not born racist. It's racism is a social construct.
Yeah.
Society conditions you to think in a particular way.
And not society, not just society, but home environments.
Absolutely.
It's like a pyramid.
Absolutely.
It's like a pyramid.
Absolutely.
Starts at one person, and then the kids, and then their kids, and
so when it comes to understanding people of color, understanding themselves as inferior, that's internalized racism. That's an example of personal racism. But also white people, consciously or unconsciously, considering themselves to be superior to people of color is also personal racism. So that's the first level of the pyramid. That's the first level, personal racism. Then if you take a step up from that, the second level of racism is interpersonal racism. So interpersonal racism is a white person's interaction with a person of color, which is discriminatory. So let's say hate crime.
Okay.
So if a person of color gets targeted because of their color by a white person, then that's an example of interpersonal racism. Yeah. So these two levels people are generally familiar with. So when we talk about racism,
I just want to quickly add in, it's also, as a disclaimer, it's not just the white people, because we also see that not on that big scale, but on a smaller scale, but we also see that between people of color as well. So from one ethnic minority group,
that doesn't fall under the definition of racism. That's why we need to dedicate a podcast. Racism is a very technical term.
Okay.
Yeah, racism is a very technical term, and so the racism needs to be differentiated from racial prejudice or prejudice in general. That's very key. There's a difference between the two. So when it comes to so this is how it's explained. So racism and racial prejudice are two separate things. So when it comes to racial prejudice, a person of color can be prejudiced towards a white person. Yes, that can happen. Similarly, a white person can be prejudiced towards a person of color. Yeah, okay. That's human. That's always been part of humanity. That's always been part of humanity. Racial prejudice has always been part of humanity. Yeah. What makes racism different to racial prejudice is the key term is power, and that's the modern social construct of racism. So that only exists in modernity, and that's tied to colonialism.
If it's power,
yes,
it would mean then the definition of racism would be different in whatever part of the world you're in. Then
no, because when we talk about power, we're not talking about power at a micro level. We're talking about power at a macro level.
Okay.
And at a macro level, because of the history of colonialism and the systems that have been put in place subsequently, white people are privileged in ways people of color aren't. And that's, if people want to learn about it, it's something we could probably dedicate a podcast on. Currently I'm reading a book. One thing I do is I keep on top of any kind of literature in the field of racism. Yeah. So there's a book that's been just published this year, The Science of Racism. But what is unique about the book in comparison to the other books I've read, the other books I've read on racism, is that he says that the existence of racism is an empirical fact. It's a scientific fact. That's the difference, and he shows through meta studies and whatnot that it's a scientific fact. So if you were to deny the existence of racism, you'd be denying reality.
So it's good that you've answered my questions on that.
Yes.
So I applaud that. Yeah. So we were on the second type, that the two types that everyone understands anyway. So
in particular, interpersonal racism. Personal racism, some people may understand, other people may not understand. But when we talk about racism, the first thing that comes to the mind of a person of color or a white person is interpersonal racism. So when we talk about racism, we think about hate crime. But if we appreciate that there's 4 levels of racism, then we understand that racism can be personal, racism can be interpersonal, but that's just one level of 4. Then the third level is institutional racism. So institutional racism, if you look at my statement again, so prior to mentioning Islamophobia in the statement, there's a paragraph I've included. If one of you could read out that paragraph.
Right, so in your statement, hence this episode alone demonstrates that there is a collective failure of the organization to provide an appropriate and professional service to people because of their color, culture, or religion. Quote, it can be seen or detected in process, attitudes and behavior which amount to the discrimination through unwitting prejudice, ignorance, thoughtlessness and racist stereotyping which disadvantage minority, ethnic or religious people, quote, unquote.
Yes. So that quotation, where's that quotation from? So that quotation is the definition of institutional racism, is based on the definition of institutional racism which you find in the Macpherson report. And the Macpherson report was the report that was commissioned on the back of the case of Stephen Lawrence. So that's what it's based on. Now, if we look at that definition of institutional, does intention matter? So if an institution has processes, but they're not intentionally discriminating against people, does that matter? No, it doesn't matter, because it could be thoughtlessness that leads to a disadvantage for a person of color. Yes. That's sufficient for it to be considered racism. Yes. So you read that definition again.
It can be seen or detected.
It can be seen or detected, yes.
In processes, attitudes, and
attitudes, and
behavior.
Behavior. See, processes, attitudes, and behavior. Okay.
Which amount to discrimination through unwitting prejudice.
Unwitting. So it doesn't even have to be conscious.
Yeah.
Someone may not even be conscious of it. It may be unwitting, yet it still falls under the definition of institutional racism.
Ignorance.
Yes.
Thoughtlessness.
Yes.
And racist stereotyping.
Yes, absolutely.
Which disadvantage minority, ethnic or religious people.
Yes. So do you see, that's the definition of institutional racism. Yeah. So that is the third level of racism. Before I get back to and apply that to college, that's the third level of racism. Then the fourth level of racism is that racism is systemic or structural. So structural racism, structural racism is basically throughout society and the institutions that exist in society, you find that there's racism. So it's not just one institution, it's all these different institutions. There's structurally, you put them all together, structurally you find racism. So that's the highest level of racism.
So in your opinion, how do you think that institutional Islamophobia is tied to this situation with Blackburn College?
Yes. So if we take Islamophobia, so we've got Palestine. Now, as we've discussed, Palestine is perceived to be Muslim. Whether it is or not is irrelevant. The definition, according to the definition of Islamophobia, is sufficient for it to fall under the definition of Islamophobia that is perceived as Muslimness. So Palestine is seen as Muslim, number one. Number two, the decision that's been made, has that decision been made by individual members of staff in college? No. We're not talking about individual members of staff in college who may be supportive of the Palestinian cause or not. That's irrelevant. But the college officially has made a decision
on behalf of
the institution. So it represents the institution, and the processes that have taken place have shown that there is an absence of professionalism. It's clear that if you've gone through this journey that I've described in this podcast, if you've gone through that journey and you abruptly make that decision, what does that tell you about the processes in that institution? That doesn't. You can't say that's an individual
No.
problem.
No,
That's an
it's collective,
institutional
yeah.
problem.
So what's the next steps that going forward for the community
And for yourself.
and for yourself?
Yes, yes.